Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to the next session of the Tortoise AI Summit. It's a little bit like a relay race where a baton has been passed from James to me with no break, but that's okay because it's interesting enough to stay. So for the next 45 minutes, we're going to be looking at talent. And as ever, if you'd like to contribute, please do so. My colleague Luke is managing the chat and will flag to me any interesting points so I can bring you into the conversation. It's really a mark of how important talent is to AI that we've heard so much about it already this morning. So Nigel Shadbolt spoke about the new kind of literacy, and algorithmic literacy, that is going to be essential for hundreds of thousands of jobs going forward. And as Carme Artigas said in the previous session, the competition for such talent is fierce. So which countries are succeeding in this war for talent, and why? Can AI recruitment procedures themselves be used to identify the best applicants? How mobile is the global talent pool? According to Benedict Evans, the pull of the US to attract talent through universities and visa systems will still be there in 10 years. Do we agree with that? And what about those left on the margins? As Sir Nigel said, a successful AI company depends not just on top-line researchers, but those who keep the server farms going. And that's not to mention the hundreds of thousands of low-paid data labelers and other gig economy workers paid less than the minimum wage. Is AI responsible for such disparities? And is there anything that AI can do to fix them? So to discuss all these subjects, we've got four great guests. Christine Foster, who's the Managing Director for Innovation at the Alan Turing Institute. Frida Poli, an award-winning Harvard and MIT neuroscientist and CEO of Pymetrics. Jean-Francois Gagné, who is the CEO of Element AI, who helped us out a lot with our index. And Taavi Kotka, he is the first CIO for the government of Estonia. So Jean-Francois, can I start with you? Each year, Element AI releases a global talent report for the AI sector. So could you just quickly summarize its key findings? What kind of patterns are you seeing in how global AI talent has moved around the world in the last 12 months or so?
There's been a lot happening for sure, and listening to the previous conversation was quite interesting. But also, we see that when you look at the way talent has been evolving, it kind of support a lot of the highlights that we heard from the prior conversation. So, of course, the talent pool has been growing, just from a technical perspective. But really, on the data labeling side, that's where we've started to see a lot of different skill set emerge and to grow in proportion. An interesting thing is, as much as using archive as a proxy, that's where most people in artificial intelligence are going to be publishing their findings. We're still seeing more and more authors. When you look at people that are dedicated to research, which has been kind of one of the interesting battle that people were all talking about on a talent standpoint early days, when people were still trying to make sense of the technology, when we were considering AI being something that is state of the art or still just emerging. We're now seeing that these jobs are not growing that much. They've actually been slowing down in terms of number of seats this year. But really where things are expanding and growing really fast is in people that are going to be applying these techniques. People who are going to be building the pipelines, are going to be labeling data, et cetera. So there's all that shift, and that we're seeing the field and the ecosystem getting more mature. Now, what's also interesting is we've seen mostly the global South being prevented from having access to a lot of that talent. And we're still seeing the global South being trailing behind. Now, one thing we don't yet can appreciate is how the pandemic's been impacting, with everybody being remote, the ability of the global South to actually tap into a lot of that talent and be able to do projects. So that'll be an interesting thing to look at as we start to get numbers next year.
I've got two follow-up questions, I think. So what conclusions can we draw from this shift away from kind of core research to applied AI techniques. What are some of the key data points that you use to measure global talent? I think you mentioned LinkedIn, and can you just go through some of the flaws potentially in that methodological approach, and address concerns perhaps that it over prioritizes countries like the US?
Of course. Yeah, so we've been using job postings globally. We've been looking at LinkedIn and what people self-report. We've been looking at archive for scientific papers. So all of these sources, of course, are skewed towards the north. So obviously, yes, it may create some blind spot on other front. Even though these platforms that we've used are still very interesting in global reach, there's still some limitation on that front. I mean, conclusions is certainly, artificial intelligence is maybe no longer something different, meaning that I really like the way it was put before, like it is just software. And yes, it's a new kind of software where humans are no longer the ones programming all the rules, right? These algorithms are going to be the ones finding patterns and making predictions. And it is influenced by the information that you feed these systems. And this is a new way to operate. It's a new way to build and operate software. But I think that's kind of what we're seeing. And then the world is starting to get more mature, more literate. And therefore, as utilization grows and as softwares evolve, we're seeing the talent pool follow.
Can you say something about how your work has shown how AI or machine learning talent moves around the world? I think you describe and categorize countries that you're looking at into inviting countries, producer countries, anchored countries, and platform countries. Can you explain what they are?
Yeah, so we're seeing that the leadership, for instance, of Canada and being a creator of AI and being one of the leader in this wave of, let's say, deep learning and AI revolution did not necessarily translate into the biggest user or the biggest platform as a country. So we look at countries like China and the US still being the biggest one to use the talent and attract the talent. We've seen quite a shift in countries' leadership all around, but still these tools are far away at the front, and then everybody else is kind of clumped, and some in the middle, but mostly trailing behind these two countries. So there's quite a bit of a lead from these two countries and utilizing the technology and taking advantage of it.
And just before I turn to Frida, who I wanted to come to next, I wanted to ask you whether your work had shown what are the kind of the major pull factors that countries can leverage in terms of attracting talent. Is it universities? Is it easy to use visa systems? General quality of life measurements?
There's some of that, but really what we're seeing is the industry and the opportunity that these organizations are creating seems to be what brings the talents to them. So the level of maturity of the two countries that I've mentioned are clearly what has been bringing most of the talent to work there. Yes, of course, there's tons of ways for countries to have all sorts of policies in terms of visa or supporting investments or subsidizing certain part of the work and doing the research, and all of these things can help. But the big picture here is these big players in industry that are at the forefront have been learning how to use the technology and being successful at it have been just growing, with a very large proportion, and then capturing and attracting that talent, and that's what we're seeing.
Thank you. Frida, can I bring in you now? Pymetrics is really fascinating because it uses AI to revolutionize how companies can recruit talent. And I just wondered whether, in the specific arena of AI talent, where the jobs market is changing so profoundly and new skills are required that potentially make the whole issue of experience less relevant, how a company like Pymetrics can help companies identify the people with the right skills to put into the right jobs.
Sure. Yeah, I think, there are a number of different ways that a technology like Pymetrics can do that. So first, we look at people's soft skills or aptitudinal fit for a role. So back to what Jean-François was saying, I think that, we need to look beyond potentially traditional pipelines to fill some of this talent. Because not all populations are as well served as others in terms of sort of the more traditional routes. So we would help a company identify somebody's potential for a role in different types of AI or machine learning functions and offer them the opportunity to highlight those folks and then potentially put them through training to get them up to speed. And I think that's particularly useful when we're thinking about, as the data we're showing previously, if there is a big divide, say, between gender or ethnicity in machine learning roles, I think that these types of more non-traditional recruiting processes can really help because our algorithms are created such that they don't have any gender ethnic bias. Therefore, they're recommending an equal number of women, people of color into these roles. And then if companies or there are other ways to train folks, boot camps, reskilling programs, and so on, we can actually start to potentially mitigate some of the gender and ethnic, disproportions essentially in these talent pipelines. So I think that there are ways to really expand the funnel and look at different ways of recruiting and training people than sort of the traditional pathways. And again, as we all race to have the best AI talent, I think we have to really sort of expand our pipeline. And at Pymetrics specifically, we have done that. We have often taken, for example, folks that have PhDs in sort of adjacent fields to machine learning, cognitive computational neuroscience would be one, for example, where it's not an ML degree, but you're using a lot of those functionalities. And I think that we have a more diverse workforce as a result than just recruiting from computer science programs, for example. So we've found this technique to be effective for us.
I see that Tom Schuler has made a really interesting point in the chat, which is to ask whether your system of recruitment handles collective intelligence, i.e. who fits in on teams in addition to just analyzing individual profiles. Does it?
That's a great question. I wouldn't call it collective intelligence. I would say what we can do is measure what we call, essentially culture fit. Culture fit, I think, is kind of a term that gets misused sometimes, but the way that I'm using it is, for example, the different, Google, Facebook, they all have sort of different ways of people that are a good culture fit there might actually be different in terms of sort of their profile. So we are kind of able to capture that as well as role fit. But we don't measure teamwork, which I think is obviously important. Another additional element that I think is important.
Do you think in terms of analyzing AI recruits in terms of culture fit, that there's a danger that the algorithms that you use can cement biases? Because I know that in Jean-François' study, he found the yearly study on AI talent, he found quite depressingly that the proportion of female AI researchers had gone up from 12% maybe to 15% in 4 years, not much at all. So how do you get out of a framework where you're cementing biases?
Yeah, so that's why I hesitate to use the word culture fit, because it is so loaded. So I would say that what we do is measure, if we're building a custom algorithm for a company, what we're really measuring is the values of that company as well. However, what I will say is that because we use soft skills. So cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes in people, those data are far more equally distributed among the population than hard skills. So if you look at engineering degrees, there's a big disparity between men and women. However, if you look at the soft skills needed for being an engineer, those are actually quite evenly distributed. So we recently had a very well-known machine learning researcher at Northeastern basically audit our entire system, including going through the source code. And he found that indeed, even if you train on a homogeneous workforce, say overly male, you will come up with an algorithm that can identify the same number of women or people of color than men who fit that soft skill profile. So I think that's what's so critical about expanding the way we look at talent, is not just to index on hard skills, but really to look at somebody's potential for a role. And again, somebody's potential for a role is far more evenly distributed among women, people of color, than their hard skill training would imply. So I would ignore what I said. Culture fit, I think, is a very loaded word. Really, we're looking at your potential to do the job. And we find algorithms that recommend an equal number of women and non-majority candidates for those roles. And we've seen that time and time again. And as I said, we have the first, I think, ever audit of an HR system that's going to be published soon, basically saying that indeed the system does exactly what I said it does. So we're excited about that.
And for you, just before I turn to Christine, I mean, for you, when it comes to analyzing why top AI talent moves into particular roles, what are the key pull factors you're seeing? If you were advising a government like the UK, for instance, on how to kind of create an environment that would attract the top talent, A, is it mobile? Is there a lot of movement from country to country? And B, what are the kind of the levers that you're seeing?
I think that's a good question. I think that obviously being close, or, having proximity to, certain sort of hubs of innovation, I think are critical. I think that, sort of investing in, that in the infrastructure for technology is also really critical. So, I mean, we're based in New York. New York had made a pretty, substantial push in the last, 5 years to really provide fertile ground for these types of companies to flourish, whether it was, incubator programs, training programs, funding that would go to companies that were, starting out in the space. And, what we've seen in New York is like a pretty big uptick in, AI companies that are starting here, getting funded. And it has really drawn a lot of AI talent. At least that's what we've seen in the sort of 5 years that we've been in the ecosystem. So I don't know if that city level, approach translates to a national approach, but I do think, sort of the tried and true mechanisms of investing in sort of a broader ecosystem that will attract the right talent is critical, regardless of kind of where you are in the world.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to turn to Christine now, if she's there.
I'm here.
Hey, Christine. The Alan Turing Institute has obviously written a lot about fairness and how to apply fairness to AI development. And I noted when I was researching this talk that there was a study recently that found that the people working on Amazon Mechanical Turk, doing these kind of low-level jobs for AI companies, were paid on average around $2 an hour, which is significantly less, obviously, than the US minimum wage. And yet an average machine learning engineer in the US now gets paid $187,000 a year. And I just wonder whether, AI itself, the AI community, should be concerned about these inequalities, or whether it's just a function of a competitive labor market. And if the former, can we do anything about it?
I guess I take that a couple different ways. One is if you look really practically at the way organizations are starting to implement algorithms in production, I'm actually seeing a much better handle on all the different kinds of roles that are required. So I think there's much less talk of data scientists as unicorns having all the skills embodied in one person, and much more acknowledgement by people who've been doing this for more than 10 years that actually, it takes a team with the different skills. And so I think what we're going to see in those companies that, have their heads on their shoulders on this is actually the data engineers, the data librarians, the data labelers, all of those as teams will be on more equal footing, I think. But I would take the question sort of pull back a little bit to the longer history of labor and work and how we've sort of seen this evolve. And I guess I would say that it's only been for a very short time, some decades in some geographies, that we've had this sort of notion of work as sort of full time and associated with the firm and with those sorts of more stable structures. I think if you look across time and across geography, that most of the world for most of the centuries has had more precarious conditions, more informal settings, and these very narrow and no social protections. And so actually I think Amazon's MTurk is probably just, it's not probably, is a current expression of those informal, dissociative, piecework models that we actually as people have known for a very, very long time. And it's not the technology that's doing that, that's a choice, right? It's a choice of values. Just like, it wasn't okay when we sent children up chimneys or down mines, right? We found sort of metal tools to fix that. What's interesting about this automation in terms of distributed tasks is actually the only part of that that's automated is the marketplace for finding these people across the world and then distributing those tasks and quality controlling them. Actually, the work is human. It's human labor. And I've heard it referred to as, artificial intelligence, right? It's actually people packaged up to look like software and sold in that way. But as you point out, there's somebody at the other side of it. So I guess I would say that this is a choice that's being made. We're not sort of passive in this. It's not being done to us. It's being, it's being created. And we have a choice on this. And I would really sort of push the, and respect the work that the Royal Society of Arts is doing around good work and a renewed social contract around what that looks like, security, well-being, freedom, growth, those kinds of things, as being actually a way of thinking about work in general. And automation obviously being a subset of that, automating things that are dangerous, automating things that are commoditized, automating things that are, tasks that are better left to computers than to people, those kinds of trends. But I think it ultimately doesn't change unless we think up the new institutions, right? The new values, the new rights, the new social contract that needs to go with changing workplace and changing work.
Thank you. I really love the phrase artificial intelligence. That's great. Is there an example that you can think of a government or a country or even a company that has implemented policies designed to make sure that these inequalities don't get too far apart?
I don't know, that's a hard one. Maybe we'll, the inequalities between the different kinds of skills. I think many organizations are still finding their way there. Like you see, the early shoots of it. You see this with emphasizing which experiences and which skills a person has rather than, right, what the sort of pedigree. You see it a little bit with testing. You see those kinds of differences. You also see sort of much more work being done on adjusting pay and transparency of pay once a person already works at a firm. So again, that's the beginnings of it in the model, in the sort of Western European model of full-time employment. But if anything, I think some of the arguments going on in California about, who's considered an employee and who isn't are highlighting that it's actually quite hard to get some of those informal, precarious piecework kinds of jobs back into what we consider, what you and I might consider the mainstream of employment. And in fact, if you look at a lot of industrial strategies around the world, they talk about jobs. And that is no longer the unit that most people experience, and was never the unit that most people experienced.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. I want to come to Tavi now, Tavi Kotka. You have huge experience, Tavi, as not only as an entrepreneur, but as the person responsible for Estonia's groundbreaking e-resident program. And so I wondered if you could give your perspective on how Estonia has performed in all aspects of talent. You've got a strong coding community. your AI meetups, and how important having that broad base of talent was to implementing this digitalization of public services?
Oh, yeah, it's a complex question. First of all, talent has been a country's priority for a decade, I think now. So IT and everything that is related with that is heavily, I'll say, supported, financed, etc. Always we could do better because there is ICT is definitely the fastest growing industry for Estonia, and then we could do more. You have seen our unicorns. We have 5 unicorns in Estonia, just 1.3 million people. So I think it's quite a result. What we are doing now differently is obviously like we have tried to attract more talent from abroad with different kind of like digital nomad visas and e-residencies and other programs. Obviously, we can't do as good as Canada and US because I mean, like still it's a small country nowhere compared with those like mighty countries in North America. So I think you have to be more precise with your question. I think one thing that the government does well is you give practice to the people. So whenever you study something, you can really quickly try it out in action. So you're not dependent on somebody like getting big contracts to customers. Outside of Estonia, you get your first skills here, providing services for the local government, local companies, national government, and then if you're skilled enough, like then you start doing export, and I think that that pipeline works rather well, like compared with other countries I have seen.
Thank you. I'd like to come in a moment to Carla Bernina, who's making a really interesting point about MTurks that's kind of counterintuitive. But Taavi, could I just ask you something about how Estonia has kept its talent? We've seen from the index that a number of smaller companies have risen up the ranks and are kind of outperforming where you'd expect them to be. What are the most important factors for a smaller country to retain and to foster talent?
I mean, there are like many aspects, but I think 2 major ones are that the work is really interesting because in Estonia you can truly see and feel the digital society. So, I mean, for example, the fact that private sector and public sector are capable to exchange all kind of data and they are actually doing it, and like they both see objects in the same way. I mean, like we have national-wise unique identifiers, not only on things but also on people. So you can combine all kind of data, like which means it's extremely interesting to try out your skills here. But the second thing, it's not all about the work only. It's also about your family and your children. And as Estonian education system is the best in Europe at the moment, we have bypassed even Finland. Then it's important for the Estonians that their children actually get very good education.
Do you think that overall public-facing factors, public services, education, investment, that those are more important than private factors for retaining talent? Which companies are based in which countries, or you know, is the obvious answer that both are important?
To be honest, like as an Estonian, and I don't want to show you the weather outside and the darkness at the moment. So I think the number 1 factor definitely is the weather, and many people choose their location because of that. And together with Finland, we can't be proud of that, like, especially during winter. But yes, you have to compensate that, and like getting like the best education or healthcare to your family is definitely, I think, more useful nowadays, combined with the clean environment and clean water and air. So like there are things that you can't buy with money. So and I think those soft things are becoming more and more important.
Thank you very much. Can we bring in Carla, please? Because Carla, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can you just make your point that you made in the chat about MTurk to the room?
Yeah, so I made 2 points. I was very interested in what Frida mentioned about no bias in their algorithms and wanted to know more about that. By the way, I'm associate professor at Surrey Business School, so doing research on these things, especially with a perspective on international development. And the other point, I guess that's the one you were picking up, regarding, the fairness and, outsourcing this work for workers in other parts of the world, and bringing more precarity actually and exclusion with choices. So you have different gig platforms that can make choices on bringing precisely that, more stability or security at work. So those were the 2 points I made on the chat, and very keen, to join this conversation. So thanks a lot.
No worries. So can I just pick up on that though? But there is evidence, is there, that platforms like MTurk can bridge inequalities rather than exacerbate them?
Yeah, basically, so you have examples of that, but basically you also have examples of whether, there are issues of humiliating population. So I recall, I've been in various conferences on this in the gig economy, where, the people that happen to be cleaning pornography are all based in Southeast Asia, right? And so whether you are given employment to then paid for that, and by the way, are normally women conducting that, you wouldn't consider that, something of bridging inequalities. It's exactly the opposite. So there are a lot of nuances on what is happening in the gig economy platform, and actually, how they are, pursuing these opportunities or actually having a choice at all, right?
I thought when I was looking at the issue of MTurk and the gig economy as a whole, that maybe we were going slightly off track, that the gig economy was like a subject in itself. And then I read that more people use platforms like MTurk, significantly more people use platforms like MTurk than drive for companies like Uber or are employed by companies like Deliveroo. It's a huge thing. Apparently 1 in 3 Americans has at some point used these platforms. Can I bring in Jim Glasgow? Is Jim Glasgow around? Jim?
Yes.
Hey, sorry to come at you out of the blue, but can you just make the point? You've made a good point about how labor might be increasingly more exploitable because the infrastructure required for setting up digital projects is not as great as it was previously. Can you just make that point potentially in a more eloquent way than I just did?
Yeah, the point that I was making is that a lot of countries have made a lot of investment in extending their digital infrastructure and bringing their networks to people. And this makes them increasingly reachable by companies that would like to exploit them as very low cost labor. And it makes those jobs particularly insecure because they're so easily transferred to another region. And much like a lot of things in the gig economy, they do require a certain amount of personal investment, whether it's to buy your own car for driving for Uber or your own computer for being a part of a digital gig economy, which you become responsible for replacing. So the company gets to have this infrastructure built by governments in other countries and equipment supplied by private citizens in jobs that are relatively easy and cheap to train, and with no security for it at all. And usually the only way to get a raise is to simply work faster.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Benedict Evans, who was in the last session, has posted something that, when you read it out loud, sounds really awful. He says the observation in Silicon Valley a few years ago, AI stands for anonymous Indians. Benedict, could you just, what are your perspectives on how inequality in this space is shifting? Is it as bad today as it was when that observation was made?
Well, so I suppose sort of maybe there's a specific and a general way to think about this. The specific way is, as I think I pointed out in the previous session, in 2013, there were like 10 people on Earth who were working on machine learning, almost literally. Like it was a failed field from the 80s that had never worked. And then there is an absolute explosion as basically, if everyone, if you'll pardon my language, everyone said, holy fucking shit, this works now. And everyone goes out and builds machine learning. And so there was an absolute gold rush in sort of 2014, 15, 16 of building companies with the purpose of getting bought. So, you know, three people have take their PhD theses, they go and register a company, register a domain name, put up a website, and Google buys them for $10 million. And so there was a sort of a period where everyone was desperately scrambling to hire people to do this. I think that's a short-term thing. And I would expect most of those sorts of salaries to normalize with, you know, good software engineers. You know, they'll normalize with the rest of the technology industry, because that's, you know, just the nature of these things. I think there's a sort of a second step, which is, you know, being a software engineer in Silicon Valley or London is paid more than working for a call center in the Philippines. And those call center jobs are increasingly going to go away because of machine learning and amongst other things, but also because of lots of other kinds of automation. But in the meantime, you've got a data set of 100,000 things and you want people to go and look at them and label them. And so there are new kinds of outsourcing jobs. I mean, another thing I mentioned in the earlier session, Vodafone globally has about 2.5 million invoices a year. And so they have an operation in India of people processing those invoices. Those people are probably paid less than somebody working in a Vodafone shop in London because the cost of living is different in India. And it's probably a much better job to have in India than working at a Vodafone shop in London. Now, Vodafone will go from 1,000 people to 100 people. But on the other hand, when they automate that with machine learning, but on the other hand, there will be all sorts of new jobs down the road, around the corner, maybe in the same building, manually labeling some other kind of thing. And so I think one of the questions here would be, is this something that's new and specific to machine learning? Is it new and specific even to computing? Or is this just sort of the function of the relocation, reallocation of jobs around the world and the sort of normal creation and destruction of new jobs? I mean, if you were to look at it from the other end, you know, part of the conversation about remote work is if you've got a moderately interesting job and you have to be in central London and now you've been sent to work from home, maybe you're competing with people in the Philippines now for that job, if that job can be done remotely. So some of the inequality conversation isn't, you know, rich people in the West paying poor people in the global South to do the job. It's middle tier jobs in the West getting relocated to the global tier South, where for people who are in the global South, wow, this is like 5 times more than I was earning before. This is a fantastic job. And so there's a lot of sort of complexity here around both the movement of value up and down the scale in India or in the Philippines, and also the reallocation of those jobs around the world. And, you know, the process 10, 20 years ago where we offshored call centers to the Philippines and then we onshored it back again. And so I would sort of situate this in a kind of a much broader conversation about where is the job, who's doing it, that isn't really specific to AI. It's sort of, you know, it's the same question as, you know, senior management at Vodafone are paid more than the people processing their invoices in India. Okay, is that inequality? Well, maybe.
It's not really the same, is it? Because in the Vodafone example, experience counts for a huge amount. A senior executive there might have 20 years experience over the guy processing the forms. Whereas I think a point that Frida has made in the past and others have made is that in this new digital economy, much more emphasis is taken away from experience and just placed on raw talent.
So I think a really useful way of thinking about what machine learning does is that you sort of relocate where you need to put the people. So, you know, imagine you want to recognize cats in pictures in 2010. You need somebody to look at every single picture to see if there's a cat in it, or more precisely, see if there's naked people in it. So you would need enough people to look at all the pictures. Now you don't need any human being to look at an individual picture, but you need somebody to have looked at 100,000 or 1 million pictures and have labeled naked people, not naked people, cat, not cat. So you're sort of relocating the point of leverage. And the extension to that is, and this, I promise this is a short answer, is that looking at a picture and saying, is there a naked person in this or not, doesn't require expertise or experience. It just kind of needs a person. It kind of needs like a mammal brain. So, you often say machine learning basically gives you infinite interns. These are things that could answer questions that could be answered by an intern. A colleague of mine used to say that machine learning will do anything you could train a dog to do, which also gets you to the AI bias question, because you're never 100% sure what you've trained the dog to do. You just think you are. But kind of that point, like you've got a bunch of people looking at this picture or all these pictures and saying cat, not cat, cat, not cat. And then you take that training process and you apply it to a billion photographs. And so you don't need any experience to say, is that a cat or not? You just need to be like a person.
I'm just going to cut you short because I want to come to Frida and to Christine and possibly to Jean-Francois to finish off. Frida, I know you wanted to respond about the issue around biases. So could you do that, please?
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to mention, as Carla was asking, how do we know that, the AI is not biased? So again, there are 21 different, definitions of fairness in machine learning. In employment, fortunately, there's one essential definition around bias. It's called disparate impact. It's essentially proportionality, statistical parity in how these algorithms perform in terms of recommending, men, women, people of different ethnic groups. So we have a sort of a clear-cut goal that we can aim towards. And, this is actually relevant to the previous panel where people were discussing, sort of regulation and so forth. I mean, we are big proponents of transparency. So I think that if you can, and again, I think that the beauty of AI is that it does leave, a paper trail, so to speak, or a digital trail, where you can actually look at the outcomes of these algorithms and say, how are they impacting? And people do this. I mean, they do this voluntarily with the company's, permission, or they sort of look at these systems without a company's permission and say, what is the impact on, people of different genders and ethnicities in terms of matching to, different jobs and so on and so forth. And so I guess the point I would like to make is that I think there is the opportunity in this new digital age, if we, agree to some sort of light, whether it's, self-regulation with companies, like Pymetrics posting their, numbers in terms of those bias ratios and, being self-transparent, or, there's sort of greater calls, I think nowadays, for potentially some light regulation. I don't think that gets in the way of innovation. I think it actually can be beneficial, so that, we can actually track what these algorithms are doing in terms of fairness. And then, one last point I'd like to make is I think that, there's a growing realization that, once we get past a certain level of inequality in society, it actually harms innovation. And so I think it's this, this dichotomy or tension rather that I think we want to balance. I think we should all want equality in general as a principle, but if that's not convincing enough, I think that overall there's growing sort of economic evidence that the more unequal a society becomes in terms of opportunity, the less innovation is really fostered. So I'll just leave it at that.
No, thank you. That's really fascinating. The whole issue around transparency and algorithmic transparency is hugely important. I read a couple of weeks ago someone saying that he was questioning how many people even inside a company that uses AI really understands how the algorithms work. Let me come back to Christine if I could.
Yeah, I'd like to say really briefly.
Go ahead.
That one of the things about exploitation going from the sort of old-fashioned kind to the digitized kind is that actually it makes it much easier to spot and much harder to ignore. So this whole, hand-wringing, saying, oh, isn't it terrible this is happening? Actually, the fact that it's on a platform means that regulators in all sorts of areas and governments can, again, make informed choices about what's considered okay and what's considered not okay, and what to do about it in a way that was much harder before. And in fact, one of the things that Turing's working on is a project around eradicating modern slavery, precisely because some of these data sets sit in financial institutions, they sit with governments, they sit with shipping companies. People are visible from space on satellites, on ships, international territory, all these kinds of things. And actually, the visibility of this problem has never been greater. It's really within our power to shift this if we chose to. So that would be a challenge, I think, to policymakers and regulators.
I'd be really interested in what the Institute thinks about the problem of globalization, though. So on the one hand, exploitation is more visible. I understand that, but what do you do if there's a US platform and a Chinese worker being exploited by a German company? Like, how does a regulation system that's based on national parameters deal with that?
Oh, I'm sorry, Alexi, I can't solve that one for you. And I'm not even going to, I mean, that's not my area of expertise. So if somebody on the, listening in knows how you do international cooperation with regulators in the face of Brexit, definitely speak up. But I would say that the sort of digitization of the problem does put a heavier responsibility on all of us to not ignore it. And can I say something else that's not answering your question, Alexi, which is actually about skills? I think if we continue to make a false split between hard skills and soft skills, we're going to find ourselves very disappointed in the sort of distinct, in what we create, both in terms of the education system with people, but also in terms of what we create when we make these little automation engines. I think there's a lot more nuance. There's plenty of good work out there already explaining all the wonderful varieties of human intelligence and how we use them together. Right? So not just social intelligence, emotional intelligence, but the metacognition, subjective intelligence, contextual intelligence, the ability to transfer concepts one to another. And I think when we spend too much time worrying about one type of calculation or prediction, or even recognition, which we're now getting from machines, it just sort of does too little to focus on all the ways that human intelligence is really wonderful and creative. And so I would just want to leave on that note to say that actually a more nuanced appreciation, whether it's in the education system or in the job market or in, Frida's algorithm for selecting candidates, I would say that human intelligence is a probably 7 or 8 dimensional problem and not 2.
7 or 8 dimensional problem that we're trying to solve in 45 minutes. Let me give the last word to Jean-Francois. I just wanted you to address very quickly how you think talent has changed, the movement of talent in AI has changed in the last 12 months during the pandemic, because it has decreased it in certain ways, has it not?
Yeah, it has decreased, and it hasn't been even, maybe unsurprisingly. And it really, when you look at the impact of the pandemic, as much as it is making, let's say, people a bit more mobile, it is also making some people much less productive. And there's been studies around the impact of the pandemic on women. Not only they were already unrepresented on the research community and on the contribution. You talked about some statistics of proportion of women in the field, but they've been unfairly impacted also in their ability to be productive during the pandemic. So clearly this is going to have quite of an impact even after, and their ability to progress, their ability to contribute, and certainly it's not going to help in a situation that was already not good from the start, right? If I may just quickly, just reacting on some piece of the conversation, talking about just more broadly job displacement and some of the new jobs that are created around artificial intelligence. And I think that one interesting way to think about this is we're really more and more displacing tasks, more than we're displacing jobs. And this is quite a fundamental aspect that is now happening at a granular level that we've never experienced before. And not only it is happening at granular level, but it's going faster than ever from something that is valuable or valued by the economy to something that is segmented and distributed maybe through mechanical Kirk to something that disappear. And then we're going to see this cycle keep accelerating. And I can tell you, being able to see exactly what's happening in the absolute state of the art of artificial intelligence in terms of research, active learning technique, representation learning, transfer learning, a lot of the advances that we're seeing in the tech are going to make a lot of the current job of annotator irrelevant, disappear. We just won't need to supervise models as much. We won't need to annotate data as much for lots of tasks. And then we'll see that cycle like keep accelerating. So as much as we've talked about these inequalities, there's going to be another form of inequality where jobs are going to disappear at an ever-growing, accelerating rate. These new jobs that used to be a task for a role that creates a small market for a little period of time and then suddenly collapse. So that's certainly something to watch moving forward, especially as the technology is accelerating, digitalization is accelerating, the pandemic is influencing that, and this is going to have even further impact more broadly on the talent pool.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm determined that we should all get a loo and a tea break before the top of the hour, when Matt D'Ancona will take over to discuss AI you can trust, taking ethics from rhetoric to reality. So thank you so much to our guests, Christine, Frida, Jean-Francois, Tavi. It was really interesting. Please do stay for the 12 o'clock session. And if you're not a member of Tortoise, you can join us for 30 days free, and the link to that will be shared in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone.